We have to wait for 30 seconds here, guys. Okay, so assalamu alaikum wa hayakumullah jami'an. A warm welcome to everyone, and thank you for attending this panel discussion on Saudi Arabia and the global energy transition. I'm Faris Suleiman. I'm a research fellow here at the King Faisal Center and a PhD candidate at the LSE. And we have a great panel for you today from a diverse set of backgrounds with expertise on oil and gas, energy security, climate change, and a few other things represented in the group. We plan on giving each of our panelists about 10 to 12 minutes for some introductory remarks on the broad topic of Saudi Arabia and how it might navigate the global energy transition and what opportunities and challenges might lie ahead. And following these remarks, I'll use the chair's prerogative to ask the panelists a few questions, and then we will turn to the audience to field questions from any of you. So we encourage you to use the Q&A function below to send us your questions. I'll also note that interpretation in Arabic is available using the interpretation function on Zoom below, so feel free to use that. And we're also live streaming on Twitter and YouTube, I believe, so welcome to anyone joining us on there. I'll introduce each of the panelists before their remarks, and we'll start first with Dr. Paul Sullivan. Paul is a Senior Associate Fellow at the King Faisal Center and a Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. He's a Non-Resident Fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington and a Distinguished International Fellow at the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations. He currently teaches a course on energy and environmental security at Johns Hopkins University. Earlier in his career, he was a full professor at National Defense University and also taught at Georgetown, the American University in Cairo, and at Yale, where he obtained his doctorate years before. Paul will talk to us a little bit about the global transition and where it seems to be headed and what we might be able to learn from previous transitions. So on to you, Paul.
Yes, Assalamu alaikum, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you might be. Saudi Arabia and the GCC are quite used to energy change, energy transitions. If anyone in the audience is in their 60s, 70s, and 80s from the region, they remember a time when there was little electricity, oil and gas revenues were not what they are now. And I know a fellow in another country, not Saudi Arabia, who's a lieutenant general, a former student of mine, who told me when he was a young boy, his car was the only one in the village. And when women would have children, he was driving morning, noon, night, and early in the morning. There were massive energy changes in Saudi Arabia. Go back to the 1960s. It was 1/10 of what Saudi Arabia uses now. Getting the oil and gas out of the ground changed the region greatly. Now think of Dubai in 1970. Pearl divers, palm trees, nice beaches, nothing like what it is now. Energy systems are systems within systems, connected with other systems and nested in other systems. That's the first lesson I teach my students. Energy students are systems within systems, connected with other systems and nested in other systems. Energy systems often have extraordinarily complex and extensive supply chains. For example, the supply chains for natural gas-powered electricity. Let's say you're someone riding on a drone along this supply chain. You first start with exploration and production for natural gas on the ground or in the sea, in a pond, whatever. Then you process, you sweeten, and you transport it. Then you have to add mercaptan to it. That smell that you get from turning on your gas stove is to make you safe. It's not natural. Natural gas has no real flavor and is colorless. The natural gas goes along a pipeline to the natural gas electricity station to be burned to produce steam to turn the turbine to produce electricity. And we're not at the end yet. From there, the electricity goes through a transformer to stepped up voltage to go through the high power lines. Then it's stepped down to be used in the distribution network. And then it goes to homes and businesses. There's another stream of this that goes directly from the high power lines to, let's say, aluminum companies and so forth. There's still a step down. This is, of course, a vast simplification of what a natural gas electricity grid or electricity station would be like. We need to add the supply chains for all the equipment, the oils, other products, labor, and more for the generation station, the transmission network over those high power lines, the transformers that are needed for other things. And this is a complex system, including information systems and more. Electricity and other energy systems are connected with other systems, such as water, communications and information, finance, food, government, education, health, first responders, national security, and all the critical infrastructure systems and networks of which you can think. Without energy systems, little will function. Energy systems are complicated in their own right, and they are intimately linked and nested with other vital systems for a country to work, to protect itself, to be healthy, to develop an educated people, to grow and develop human security. So the transition of an energy system can be even far more complex and costly than just changing fuels. Most of the time when people talk about energy transition, they show fuels changing. It's a lot more than that. Other systems and supply chains need transitioning as well. We can have energy resource transitions, which is those changes in the fuel. We can have energy carrier transitions. I'll give an example of that. We can have energy converter transitions, and we can have energy services transitions. And many of these, if not all, can be connected with each other at any time and can be disconnected. We can have transitions of all or part of these happening all at once. Let us think of the following examples from Saudi Arabia in my own country, the United States. Moving from the camel and horse to the automobile. And I'm sure there are people in this audience that saw that change happening. The energy service is transportation. The transition was from the camel or horse to the automobile. The energy resource would be food, water, and such for the camel and the horse. The energy resource transition is from food, water, and such for the camel and the horse to gasoline, diesel, and electricity for the automobile. That electricity could be from coal, oil, natural gas, solar, wind, nuclear, geothermal, or fuel cells. So a transition we see every single day. And folks listening in, think about your lifetime. Even if you're a younger person, what energy transitions have you seen in your life? The energy converter in this case is the camel or horse in the beginning, and it transitions to the internal combustion engine. At a while in the past, they were gas powered and also electric ones, but those fell to the wayside because of Ford and Rockefeller teaming up to make sure that the gasoline motor internal combustion engine dominated. And now we're heading into electric cars, hydrogen fuel cells, and possibly something we haven't even thought about yet. The energy carrier transition is from the physiology of the horse and camel to the automobile gas tank, battery, or fuel cell bank. Now think of many other transitions in the past, such as when people moved from wood to whale oil to kerosene, to coal, to oil, to natural gas, to electricity for lighting. I say whale oil because I grew up in New England, not far from the whaling ship, where the whaling ships used to go out. I'm not that old. I wasn't there when the whaling ships were going out. The transitions from hand washing of clothes to the washing machine is another. The transition from wood to coal to oil to natural gas to electricity and possibly geothermal for heating and cooling. Cooking has had transitions from wood and other agricultural waste to coal to LPG, what many of you would know as butagás, to electricity. Desalination uses a lot of oil and gas. In Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, it's moving towards solar and possibly nuclear. Geothermal is another source of energy for desal. Electricity itself went from coal to oil to gas to nuclear to renewables, and who knows what's next. Along the way, hydropower and wind also occurred, But when a transition happens, it doesn't mean that the things that they're taking over from disappear, because we still have wind, we still have hydro, we still have oil, we still have gas in many parts of the world. When thinking about these transitions, think about relative prices. This is what drives things, and technology changes. When England changed from coal heating, from wood heating and cooking to coal, it was because wood became too expensive. England became urbanized. Most of the trees around the cities were cut down and the price of wood went through the ceiling. At the same time, the steam engine was developed to get the water out of the coal mines. And also transportation was changing. Canals were built in England. So coal became much cheaper and it was cleaner. Another reason why coal took over from wood, well, it wasn't cleaner. I'll get to that later, because of the cost, because of the technology change. The development of metal pipes for natural gas made it easier to transport that natural gas, the coal, to many places where it could never have been transported. Also, it could be put into tanks as compressed natural gas or LPG. Coal also brought huge deadly smogs to London. The smog in London from coal going up the chimneys was killing people in the hundreds, sometimes in the thousands. Look at what New Delhi today looks like, mostly because of coal use. And that was another reason why England moved from coal to other sources of energy and converters for the services of heating and cooking. A growing population and increased incomes is important for an energy transition to happen. Without this growth, it's very difficult to get people to invest in new transitions. But going back in time, new technologies brought these growth of population and income along. It helped it go along. Many of these were unknown when these changes were happening in the past, much like right now. We think we might know what might happen, what technologies might exist in the next 10, 20, 30, 50, right? We don't, we have no idea. Take a look when you go home, those of you who are listening, what new technologies have been developed since the 1960s even. Now look at 1900. Nobody could have guessed. Inventions, particularly new inventions, and diffusions of those inventions will be crucial for the success of the next transition. Adapting to these inventions to different environments will also be needed. Leadership will be needed. We need champions of change. Saudi Arabia has one. The United States has thousands of them, and they seem to be all going in different directions. The meeting at COP showed how many different champions are trying to figure out a different route. We have to get together, folks, and strategize and think critically and think subtly and figure out what the best direction might be for each and every one of our countries and for the world. We need planning and government policies. Those people who think the private sector is going to do this, well, to use an American expression, they're talking through their hats. That's a subtle way of saying they don't know what they're talking about. We need to build new infrastructure for the new energies that are coming. We have built these for oil, gas, coal, electricity, nuclear power, and so much more in the past, but this legacy infrastructure could hold us back. It can produce inertia. Anyone who's worked for a very large corporation, they have their legacy methods of doing things. And you try to bring in a new idea, unless you're the CEO or in a high management position, or let's say married to the daughter or son of the CEO or someone in a high management position, your idea will be stopped by the inertia of legacy systems. These earlier transitions also created huge changes in economies, societies, and in the people in those economies and societies. Expect similar massive changes in the future in many places. Just looking at energy transition and fuels is far from enough. One must keep an eye on and react to events happening during any energy transition that can affect economic, energy, water, food, national, and human security of a country in the world. Otherwise, this thing could be stopped in its track or slowed down. We can see this with the energy shocks happening in Europe right now. What the main difference, the next transitions compared to the ones I talked about previously, and of course, this is very quick, it's 200 years of history in 8 minutes, is this will be focused on social costs and externalities from emissions, pollution, from various energy sources, energy carriers, and energy converters. A focus will be on climate change. Now, each and any one of these energy systems add to it or subtracts from it. A focus will be on the overall environment and the declining willingness of people to accept pollution and extreme weather events. And if they don't think more of this is coming, get ready, folks. Watch what's happening to the weather in the United States. Look at what's happened over the last 30, 40 years. The first time I started working on climate change was at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in 1986. I've been looking at this stuff for a long enough time to realize this is happening, folks, and we need to do something about it. But we also need to focus on energy security, energy resilience, energy reliability, and how each of these is connected with human security and human development, national security, and more. Yes, the new transitions will be more. There'll be lots of VUCA in these transitions: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. They will be messy and jagged at times. They could cause economic and political shocks, social unrest, conflict, and some governments might even topple. There will be winners and losers. And for the reasons I just most recently enumerated, there will be a need for justice in all of this, or real problems could happen. Adl, Mizan, Ehsan. If we don't have this and these major changes, there will be trouble. There could be massive benefits from the next transitions for human security. If done right, the energy, water, food, and human security of many parts of the world could get much better. Staving off the deleterious effects of climate change could be a massive win for all of humanity, but we need to do this at not great cost to economic, energy, and human security. Some people just want to barrel forward. This is not the way to do things. We need to focus on how to get the most out of the future energy transitions for Saudi Arabia, for the United States, and for the greater good of all. I guess that shows my New England attitude toward ethics. Morality is a big part of this too. Ethics and morality, a big part of it. Of course, making money is part of it, and being a powerful country. But we have to think of the ethics and morality, and we have to express it properly, or the people will not be happy. And we all know what can happen from that. We will have many chances to adjust along the way. Our energy resources, our energy carriers, our energy services, our energy converters. If we're going to try to plan right now for the next 50 years, and step by step, we will be wrong. Anyone try to plan your lives when you're a teenager and see how many changes happen? Same thing happens in energy systems. We can change our systems within systems, connected with other systems, nested in other systems for the greater good and the good for our countries. We need strategic thinking. We need creative thinking. We need subtle thinking. For Saudi Arabia, its greatest challenge may be to adjust to, adapt to, and prosper in what is likely to be a mostly post-fossil fuel world. There will still be demand for oil and gas in the world. The IEA 2050 report, the Princeton report, all point out about 25% of the oil and gas that we demand now may be demanded in 2050, 2060, and so forth. Predicting these things, it's impossible. If someone asks me what will be the price of oil in 2 weeks, I will tell them straightforwardly, I don't have a clue. Even just looking at the factor of what the Federal Reserve Bank is doing now will change what those expectations might do. And I think Youssef will support me on that one. Saudi Arabia is starting to move ahead on these issues. Investments in solar, hydrogen, ammonia, the circular carbon economy, carbon capture and utilization, NEOM, increased energy efficiency, and reductions in food, water, and energy waste, and more. Saudi Arabia's other great challenge may be to help make itself and other parts of the world more climate environmentally friendly. That is part of your country's responsibility to the world. Same with my country. Saudi Arabia is enabling these through the Saudi Green Initiative, the Middle East Green Initiative, and much on the ground planning investments and efforts to reduce waste, food, and energy and water. Saudi Arabia has great challenges ahead. The United States have great challenges ahead. The world has great challenges ahead, but also has great opportunities. There's a massive opportunity out there for this. Businessmen listening on this, the amount of money that could be made in the transition could be in the trillions. I was in a meeting many years ago at the Brookings Institute, and the fellow who was running it wrote $3 trillion on the blackboard. Yes, we were using a blackboard at that time. And I asked, what's that all about? And he said, that's how much money is involved in the energy transition. I hope we get to many of these in the discussions. Thank you very much. Thank you to the King Faisal Center for this invitation and the chance to speak with you all.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for those remarks. A lot to think about, and I'm sure we'll circle back to some of the ideas that you raised. Now we'll hear from Dr. Aisha al-Sarihi, the great Dr. Aisha. Aisha is a newly minted research fellow at the National University of Singapore Middle East Institute and a non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. So we have two AGSIW representatives in our panel today. Aisha's areas of research expertise and interest include clean energy policy and climate economics, policies and governance with a focus on the Arab region. She too obtained her PhD at Imperial College. I think Youssef, she shares that in common with Youssef. And her postdoc research at the LSE Middle East Center was working on assessing the economic implications of climate change in the GCC. She's also a former visiting scholar at Georgetown. And most recently, Aisha spent some time in Riyadh at CAPSOC, the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies Institute Center, where she was a research associate in the Climate and Environment Program. So I'll hand it over to you, Aisha.
Thank you very much, Faris, and it's a pleasure to be part of this panel today. On my turn, I will speak about Saudi Arabia and its net zero emission target. As we almost, I think, all know that in late October of this year, Saudi Arabia announced its net zero target by 2060, joining another 135 countries globally. And indeed, as also Paul has mentioned, Saudi Arabia announced many climate-related initiatives that could serve the country in meeting its net zero target. And if you also is interested on looking at the summary of those initiatives, I just released a commentary with the CAF Chris as well, which summarized those initiatives from both national, regional, and global levels. Leaving that aside, I think now the challenge for Saudi Arabia and for the other countries that set a net zero target is to put forward a strategy that help in achieving that net zero target, and in a way that could help in keeping global warming within 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, given that that countries have different economic contexts as well as different environmental contexts, their strategies in achieving the net zero target will not be uniform. And for Saudi Arabia, as a country that depends heavily on the hydrocarbon export revenues for its economy, and where the environment can be described as a desert environment, I put forward for today's talk key messages that needs to be put into consideration while designing a net zero a strategy for achieving the net zero target in Saudi Arabia. The first one is understanding what is net zero and why do we need it. So the net zero target is a term that has emerged in the last 3 years or so, and it's gained momentum since 2018. It refers to the process where all the greenhouse gas emissions that we release into the atmosphere need to be counterbalanced by removing the greenhouse gas emissions in a process known as a carbon removal. And then the question, why do we need to achieve net zero emissions? We need to achieve the net zero emissions because the science have shown, especially the release of the IPCC special report on the global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, it emphasized that in order to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius warming within reach, global greenhouse gas emissions need to reach net zero by the mid of the century. This goal for the net zero has been re-emphasized again with the release of the IPCC 6 assessment report, the Climate Change 2021, the Physical Science Basis. And for the IPCC reports, they are usually put together by over 200 scientists from all over the world. So the message that I want to deliver here, that we need to remember that achieving net zero emissions will help keeping global warming within reach, and hence avoiding a catastrophic impact of the climate change, not only in the other parts of the world, but also at home. So that should be the compass that guides our strategy, designing our strategy to achieve the net zero. The second thing to put into consideration is to understand the risks and economic implications posed by achieving net zero targets somewhere else in the world. So, as per the net zero tracker, there are currently 135 countries around the world have set a net zero target, covering 88% of global emissions and 90% of global GDP. Now, while there is uncertainty on how fast these countries will achieve their net zero target, and while there is no consensus among studies on how net zero target will be achieved, some studies suggest that to achieve net zero target, 90% of global electricity generation should come from renewables by 2050, and the share of electric vehicles should be about 86% by 2050. What does that mean for Saudi Arabia? For Saudi Arabia, as a country depends on the oil exports revenues, such a future featured by reduced demand on hydrocarbon could impose risk to its main source of income, especially that its main oil importing countries, including Japan, China, South Korea, India, and the US, all have set a net zero target for themselves. So here the message is that I want to convey that while trying to achieve net zero at home, it is also important to keep in mind the potential economic risks that can be imposed by other countries' adoption of net zero. Importantly, for hydrocarbon dependent countries, we need to think about what are the strategies that helps to mitigate those potential economic risks, including, for example, enhancing the economic diversification at home. The third point is to understand what does it take to get there? What is the scale of transformation needed to achieve net zero targets? As Paul mentioned, there is not only the system of the energy, but it's connected with the other systems. Now, with that, all the GCC countries that have announced a net zero target, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain, none of them so far have based their announcements on scientific studies that build, for example, on any kind of modeling that, for example, shows information about the scale of investments, and also what size of also investments that we need, for example, in renewable energy, energy efficiency, carbon capture, and storage, and what size of scale also is needed per sector. We also don't have enough information about how much emission offsetting can be achieved by projects like tree planting, especially in such desert environment. It's also important to know or understand what are the institutional settings, the policies, the regulations and reforms that are needed to facilitate achieving net zero across the different sectors. And the final point that I want to convey today is the importance of putting innovation at the heart of achieving net zero strategies. For Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries, enabling technological innovations at home is really important for two main reasons. The first one, that we in the GCC we heavily rely on importing technologies, different technologies, including the clean technologies from other countries. However, most of those technologies, when you bring them home, you need to adapt them to be fit with the special conditions at home. So the localization of these technologies will help in avoiding not only the cost of importation, but also the cost of adapting those technologies to fit to the special conditions at home. The second reason is that when you localize the technological innovation at home, especially for hydrocarbon-dependent economies, then you enhance the competitiveness of the country in a hydrocarbon-concentrated world. I will stop there.
Thank you, Aisha, for your remarks. Also, a lot there to pick up on later in the Q&A session. So we'll move on now to Dr. Youssef Shammari. Dr. Youssef is an honorary senior research fellow at Imperial College and an expert member at the Group of Experts on Sustainable Energy at the UN Economic Commission for Europe, where he's been advising countries on better strategies for decarbonization and cleaner use of fossil fuels. Youssef has contributed writing to a wide range of publications, including CNN, Forbes, CTGN, and others, and alongside his consulting and advisory services, he's been a professor of engineering economics at Prince Mohammed bin Fahd University in Saudi Arabia. He obtained his PhD as well from Imperial College London, and is going to present and speak to us briefly about a market perspective on this energy transition. Floor is yours, Dr. Youssef.
Thank you, Faris, for presenting me, and I'm very pleased to be invited by King Faisal Center. And I thank also the previous panelists, Paul and Aisha, for their amazing presentations. I think I've got some slides to present, but I can't see them.
Let's see if Khulud can help us with that. She might be working on it now.
I have some slides to share.
I'll just use this moment بالعربي يقول تذكير بسيط للمستمعين انه متوفره الترجمه باللغه العربيه عبر زوم في اسفل الشاشه. Just a small reminder that interpretation and translation is available on our webinar today. So the slides are ready, and back to you, Dr. Youssef.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah. So as you said, Faris, so what I'm going to speak about today is energy transition from a market perspective. And here what I would like to bring is how oil markets and natural gas and carbon markets will really have a direct impact on the future that we are trying to achieve when in terms of the net zero. Can you go next slide, please? So if we look at the OPEC outlooks, the latest OPEC outlooks, what did they see? They see that from between 1920 and 2045, there is a possibility of an increase of oil demand by about 20, that's something like 18 million barrels. So if we consider compared with the demand in 2019, this is just an extra 8 million barrels increment in oil demand by 2045. And in fact, that is the year where also the organization expects a peak in demand by that year. So, in fact, there is an expectation that the OECD demand in the oil or the Organization of Economic Organization, OECD, this is the Organization of Economic Cooperative Development, and expecting that the oil demand will peak by something like 2024. So this is just a few years from now. And most of the remaining demand is expected to come from China, India, and other non-OECD members, particularly in Asia. So if we look at that, there's something like 8 million barrels that the world will, or the major producers will really need to take a key share in terms of meeting that particular demand by the next year. Next slide, please. So, on the other hand, if we look at the BP scenario, which is the controversial scenario that BP has published just last year, they have a different outlook. And one of the controversial views that BP sees is that if the net zero target is to be achieved, then the peak or demand for oil is likely to peak by 2024. And there is an expectation that the oil demand will drop to around 25 million barrels by the mid of the century. And that is if the world is to achieve the net zero targets. So in fact, I would compare them in a way that we see that the OPEC demand scenarios where possibly the net zero is not being considered, while the BP scenario is the one where we have three scenarios, and the most, let's say, stringent scenario where the oil demand is likely to drop by about 25 million barrels. And the difficulty here is that there are other two scenarios, but these two scenarios, of course, they do not achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius. And by the way, these scenarios have also been published, again, some other forecasts by the IEA, most recently early in 2021 around March. And there is a kind of close projections also being published by the IEA. Next slide. So if we look at the emissions, and to achieve these emissions, we going business as usual, as many possibly of the audience may know, that we're going to have emissions going up to 60 gigawatts, around reaching about 60 gigawatts by mid of the century. And to achieve the net target, there are a range of technologies that we have to actually include in our energy mix. And renewables actually is expected to contribute by at least 70 to 80% of that particular mix. And that has been the main subject of the recent discussions in COP26. And in fact, I believe here, as we see, what the IEA also has mentioned is that with current pledges, we're likely to achieve the 1.9 degrees Celsius. And there has been a major, I would say, an agreements among different countries on how to bring that, or to achieve that higher into 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to the 1.9. So next slide, please. So, but if we look at one thing here, that's which had a direct impact on how the world will move from now until the next 20 years of the century. So if we, in 2019, and why I'm showing here is just before the COVID-19 pandemic, if we look at carbon prices, which will have a direct impact on how the world will move towards energy transition, carbon markets have been around between $20 and $30 or euros. That's in the EU price. And that is something they've been kind of stable. And there was also a major uncertainty about climate commitments. Of course, we know that President Trump at that time has been the president of the United States, and the withdrawal from the US agreement also kind of has reduced the momentum about climate action. Also, we see that gas prices has also been low, and that is particularly due to the abundance of gas supplies. And there has also been a very much high investments in alternative energy technologies. But then after the COVID-19 or the 2020, when has been the COVID-19 pandemic, if we look at here, the carbon markets or the carbon prices went down to as low as 16 euros. And this has been the lowest price. Why? Because emissions have reduced. And in fact, during the year 2020, of course, we all remember the lockdown that took place around the world. And then going back to 2021, which is the recovery year, just look at how the carbon prices shooted. And this has been mainly due to the opening of economic activities and a major comeback to fossil fuels. So while there has been a major, let's say, call for the greener growth, the significant rise in carbon prices shows that there has been a major demand for fossil fuels again. And of course, that includes aviation, transport, petrochemicals, and all other key sectors that the oil industry or the oil actually will supply energy to. Just more recently, if you also look at the gas crisis, and just the beginning of towards the in Q3 this year, the major see that there is a major increase in gas prices here. And this also has fueled a major rise in carbon prices as well. So again, this actually, why I'm mentioning it here is because this happened while the COP negotiations actually were taking place in Glasgow, and possibly it could have affected how policymakers will consider their pledges towards the climate action, because it means that they will have to reevaluate the investments that they will have to make towards clear agenda. And let's also mention, not forget that the sudden and significant drop in gas prices was also driven by a major investments in renewables over the past 10 years. And of course, there has been a major supply disruption, particularly in wind in Europe, and low investments in gas markets, which we saw an example here in 2019, which has led to a significant jump in gas prices in 2021. And this is possibly likely to continue, especially as we move towards colder winter in 2022. Next slide, please. So looking now at the oil markets and how the oil market has been much in a slightly better condition since the historic agreements of OPEC Plus. Of course, we all remember last year when OPEC Plus did not agree on and did not have an agreement at the heart of the COVID-19 pandemic in Vienna in March. And this has led to a significant decline in oil prices around March 2020. And then there has been because we have seen the financial markets and oil and all the other the stocks all falling and companies filing bankruptcies, and all that was a reason because the collapse in oil prices, which has also we have seen the United States President Trump broking an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Russia, which was actually a historical agreement. Which is now extending until the end of 2022. And because of that agreement, we have seen a stable oil market since June last year until now. So as you can see, and of course, we all saw the WTI going to minus $37 last year. And then since the OPEC Plus agreement has been quite stable, this has been a major driver for stability in other economic sector. And of course, this has also, I would say, supported the United States administration in calling for a better climate action when President Biden took office early this year. Next slide, please. So now we can see one thing here is compared with last year to this year is that oil prices continue to increase. And why is that increase? It's because we are making it hard for fossil fuel companies to try and produce. And there are also being concerns about providing investments in the fossil industry because of the ESGs and climate agenda. So fossil fuel prices, or especially oil prices here, they've been higher than $80. And even the recent decrease in prices below $80 was just because of re-emerging concerns about Omicron and other variants of COVID-19, but I would expect oil prices to be above $80 if we continue to have ambitious climate targets. And one thing here is that these oil prices, when we have high oil prices, in fact, what does that mean? It means that oil companies will have higher budget to finance the energy transition. And this has been really the we also have seen that back in 2010 until 2014, when oil prices were always above $100, which has fueled the development of alternative sources of energy. If you go to the next slide, I would like to show here, between 2010 and 2014, oil prices have been higher than $100 for some time. And of course, President Obama has a different approach to Trump and Biden. And I would say here, he has supported the development of the US shale revolution. And if we wouldn't have seen the development of the US shale if oil prices have not been higher than $100. But one thing also is that this period has been the most important period for the development of renewables, that is wind and solar. So going back again to 2016, when President Trump was in office, we saw that the one thing here is that the number of this shows here prices and the number of the US oil rigs. So President Trump has also continued that momentum, where we saw the production of the United States reaching 13 million barrels, and also there has also been a high interest in investments in the US upstream industry. But now going to President Biden, the number of the US oil rigs remained below 500 rigs, despite rising high oil prices. And that's here one thing which also was mentioned by Prince Turki Al Faisal, is that where the current US administration is calling for low gasoline prices, yet with high climate ambitions targets. So there is there has been kind of a contradiction, because I would say here is that if you want gasoline prices to remain low, then you need to stimulate production from home. And as we also saw since President Biden took office, we saw cancellation of major US pipelines, the Keystone pipeline extending or supplying oil from Canada to the United States, banning drilling for oil on federal land, and also making it harder for the US oil industry to pump or reach to the pre-COVID production levels. So there is now something like 2 million barrels of the capacity from the United States production. And that's what's also contributing to the high oil prices, which if you go to the next slide, so now, what we'd like to know now is what are the opportunities for Saudi Arabia with that all energy transition, taking into account the market perspective. Of course, here, the most important thing that Saudi Arabia can play a key role in is the circular carbon economy. And circular carbon, really what it means is that capturing carbon and reconverting it into fuels. So with that principle, that means where Saudi Arabia can have a key role in gasification technologies, producing methanol, ammonia, and also blue hydrogen. Also vegetation, where planting trees can contribute to minimizing carbon emissions from aviation or the other transport sector. And also one important thing that the kingdom can also take a lead on is the mineral industry, because all the energy industry will require key minerals, including silicon, platinum, gold, nickel, and all other minerals that the kingdom is blessed with. So, and I believe here the kingdom will have to move towards diversification pretty much in production of fuels from hydrocarbons and also producing minerals from other key sectors. If you go to the next slide, there is something I'd like just to highlight here, which is the blue hydrogen principle. So one thing here that can be very interesting, and that's something I worked on when I was at Imperial College, is producing hydrogen from oil wells. And that is not being developed on a large scale yet, although the idea may be available and it's been practiced for coal in Australia and other countries. But here, what can be done actually is injecting steam and oxygen, converting all of the oil underground into hydrogen, and then producing the hydrogen from a surface with capturing carbon, and then producing that hydrogen or converting it to ammonia. Already Aramco has taken similar initiatives, and it has shipped its first blue ammonia cargo to Japan, And Saudi Arabia is also planning to produce 4 million tons of hydrogen by 2030. Of course, a large share of that will be blue hydrogen. And I believe processes like these can be key for the kingdom's success in the blue hydrogen sector. If you go to the next slide. So another study that we did also is that where the kingdom, of course, can also play a role in driving the transition within home. So if you look at this study, which we did back in 2015 when I was at KAUST, it shows that the kingdom can maintain usage of carbon capture and fuel oil until 2050. And after that, to achieve its climate targets, then it has to move to renewables and the nuclear. And one interesting thing here is that we have seen what would be the impact of oil price on the carbon capture technology at home. And what we found is that at prices as low as $20, carbon capture can still be economic, because you would need to capture carbon, send it to oil fields nearby, and then enhance the oil recovery from nearby wells. And here I believe Saudi Arabia can have an economic advantage from any captured carbon because of the abundance of oil wells around. And I believe already Aramco has have done some pilot projects testing in Uthmaniyah, testing a CO2 injection for oil, for enhanced oil recovery. And they have avoided something like 500,000 tons of annually of carbon. If you go to the next slide. So just these are some certain uncertainty issues about energy transition, which can be COP negotiations, US, in fact, unifying priorities on agreement and the narrative. We all remember what happened last November when some countries asked the president of COP26 to change the narrative from phasing out coal to phasing down coal. And of course, because countries will have different priorities on how they can achieve their energy security, also how the US deals with China can be an important also aspect when it comes to energy transition. OPEC Plus decision, again, oil market stability is critical for the energy transition to happen. And also one thing also here is the US policies. So if the United States continue to seek for low gasoline prices, I believe here there can be a contradiction on how we can achieve the climate targets, because we all remember what happened possibly in France back in 2018 when ambitious climate targets led to an increase in energy prices, and that's what drove the Youssef movement back in 2018. Also, what happened in the future in the United States administration over the next 4 years, whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats, they all have different agenda when it comes to climate actions. And I just would like to conclude with my final slides here is that if we want to consider energy transition, the IEA has published a graph before, and since 1919 until 2021, there has been an energy transition since 1919. But what also need to take into account is that there has been a large increase in the scale of energy consumption. And that's what also we need to consider when trying to debate energy transition. So one thing here is that public policies do not change reality. So we need to consider that. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Youssef. You took us on quite an interesting tour of the global energy transition from the perspective, particularly of oil markets. What I'll do is I'll raise a couple of points that I think tie in some of the remarks that were made by you and Aisha and Paul, and I'll direct questions towards each one of you. The first thing that I think came to mind, and we'll obviously also get a chance to get some of the questions from the audience, which I'm continually reading, so keep them coming. I'll have a look at the Q&A over the course of the next few minutes. One thing that comes to mind, and I think zooming back into the Saudi case, how Saudi is going to navigate this energy transition, we had a great sense from the speakers about how the global transition is gonna shape out, and some indications about the circular carbon economy, about potentially a hydrogen strategy that seems to be developing in some Gulf states. But I think one of the things that comes to mind, and particularly after the pandemic, is that maybe in the US and in the OECD and other net zero countries, we're seeing the potential for serious underinvestment in the oil and gas industry, and the potential for another one last party, a situation in which we can see $100 oil price or more for a few more years. And that brings the question, what would that look like inside Saudi? Do we see that hastening the transition, making it more quick, or do we see that potentially slowing down the transition? So I'll start maybe with Aisha, asking you, do you think a higher oil price would be beneficial to the transition of the Gulf states, of Oman, of Saudi, or do you think it would be detrimental?
So I think first of all, the Gulf states do understand that the global energy transition is happening in the other countries, as you mentioned. However, at the same time, for Saudi Arabia especially, it sounds like the hydrocarbon will and the demand for it will continue in the future. And then the higher prices well, the share of the hydro of the GCC oil in the future will be higher, especially if there is a decline in the demand. And the high prices will be beneficial for the GCC countries in that case. So for the GCC, this could be seen as an opportunity rather than a challenge.
Okay. Paul, maybe I'll ask you as well, and maybe also touch on some of these broader themes that you brought up. It strikes me that in the case of Saudi Arabia and some other countries, there are a few things that seem to be quite clear. So we're going to transition our electricity generation to mostly renewables by 2030. Maybe the transport sector will be electrified and we'll have electric vehicles. But there are some other more difficult parts of the equation in industry, in petrochem, and other places. What do you see as some of the most difficult, some of the most challenging areas of this transition for Saudi and for other countries?
Yes,
Well, there are, oh, sorry.
Maybe we'll go to Paul and we'll come back to you, Aisha.
Okay. Well, there will be many complexities. Well, first of all, if we're going to have a transition, which my guess will happen in Saudi Arabia, we have to think about why 2030 was even started. It was really based on the huge price drop in oil in 2014 and 2015. The 2030 program started soon after that, and that involved all kinds of diversification. But for Saudi Arabia, it also has to deal with the development of skills and training of its people to work in these new industries of geothermal, of solar and hydrogen and ammonia, petrochemicals and so forth. It would be best if Saudi Arabia trained and educated its people to work in these new changes so they could benefit from the transition instead of just watching it. Don't rely on McKinsey and their $250,000 documents that they send to you to explain what you need to do, because you pretty much know what you need to do. One big problem with all of the shifting and changing in the price of oil is the Saudi budget is like a roller coaster. If the prices of oil go up because of the low investment or inadequate investment, which I'm seeing, Youssef is seeing, and pretty much everyone watching the oil markets is seeing, particularly in shale oil, people are looking at oil investments as risky now because of these changes that they're seeing from governments. If the price goes up to 100, I think one of the first things that's going to happen, if it goes even beyond that, is the VAT in Saudi Arabia may be reduced. That may not be directly connected to what we're talking about, but that discussion has already started because of the pushback that's happened from it. Education, training, diversifying the economy, changing the budget. Saudi Arabia should rely much less on oil and natural gas. Focusing on CCE, the circular carbon economy, and carbon utilization and sequestration. That's going to take a lot of effort, a lot of investment. Desal needs to be changed. There will be huge challenges in the future, but huge benefits as well. You have places like Cost. You have excellent universities now in Saudi Arabia. I was looking at the list of the top universities in the world, and some of yours were right near the top. That was not the case when the 2030 was written. It was not the case in the 1970s. This is a different Saudi Arabia. You are much more flexible. You're much more capable. But the changes that will come will be a challenge not only to your people, particularly the younger people who have a pretty high unemployment rate, and that has to be dealt with, but also to your leadership. And this is going to be affecting every country in the world, but Saudi Arabia possibly more than others because of the percentage of its GDP and its revenues it relies on oil. There are a few countries that rely more on it. I think Iran, Algeria, and some others are going to be hit even harder. Huge challenges. But how do we get beyond that? It's going to take what we call a full court press in basketball, but all of government approach, but also society approach. Everyone has to be on board. And I'm neither a Democrat nor a Republican. I could care less what their policies are, except that they help the country and the markets that I look at. Thank you.
Great. Maybe we'll, before circling back to Aisha, we'll go to Dr. Youssef and we'll ask you, I'm not going to ask you to speculate on the oil price, but ask you what you think about what a high oil price does to the energy transition in the Gulf. What does it do for Saudi? Does it become more rapid? Does it help us move more quickly, or does it slow the process down?
Well, the economic answer here is that when you have high oil prices, it means that people will go to alternatives because the cheaper the energy, the more attractive. So I believe at the high oil prices, energy transition will be faster. That's from an economic perspective. But the other answer is that the kingdom will have more financial resources to diversify. And as you know, NEOM, 2030 projects, all aiming to make the economy more resilient away from oil and it reduce its dependence on oil. So in fact, high oil prices will enable the kingdom to diversify quicker away from oil, and it will also globally, it will drive transition to alternatives much quicker.
So you think on all sides of this, that will be a positive development for the transition? Absolutely. Okay, great.
Because oil companies, if they want to finance transition, they wouldn't be able to do that if oil prices are low.
That's true. One thing I did want to also ask while I have you is, I think one thing people from outside the oil and gas industry maybe find a little bit confusing, might be useful for our audience to understand, is how would you describe the Saudi kind of oil strategy in the midst of a net zero target? So I think some people might be familiar with the Aramco prospectus that we saw a couple of years ago, with the aim of Saudi being a kind of low carbon oil producer, last man standing strategy, low cost oil producer. How does that square with a net zero target? I imagine there's some interesting accounting that goes into this. COP26 played a part, but do you have anything that you could say that would kind of make that clearer for a lay audience? Dr. Youssef, maybe we'll start with you and we'll go to Aisha after that.
Could you please just if you say the question?
Sure. I was wondering how it might be, I think, sometimes confusing to people outside the oil and gas industry to understand how Saudi and Aramco specifically can have a last man standing strategy. They want to continue to produce oil for many years to come, be a low carbon oil producer, a low cost oil producer. But at the same time, we want to be have a net zero target in 2060. Okay. So how do you square those two things? What does that look like?
All right. Okay. So here is that there is a way to use oil in a sustainable and climate-friendly way, and I believe this can happen. So when it comes to Aramco is the lowest cost producer in the world, and also one of the lowest, or I would say the lowest carbon intensity in terms of production, because we don't need really high energy or so much energy consumption to produce oil from the kingdom, and at least in the Gulf region. So that's one thing. Now when it comes to exporting oil to other countries, then the consumers will have to make use of oil with carbon capture. So here the difficulty is when it comes to transport or aviation. So I believe here there needs to be kind of compensation for the consumption of oil in the transport sector if you do not capture the carbon, or the aviation by so-called the green agenda. So planting trees and so on to compensate for any emissions in carbon. So I believe in a way that can have a net zero, enable us to achieve the net zero while depending on fossil fuels. So carbon capture is a very important technology. And also the other approach is converting the oil into hydrogen while capturing carbon and then burning hydrogen, which doesn't emit any carbon. So I believe these two strategies can enable the oil companies to achieve climate targets while maintaining their oil in business.
Dr. Aisha, maybe we go to you, and if you could touch on some of these ideas about, maybe give us also some insight from the COP26 and climate negotiations, and how the climate regime is shaping up to deal with this kind of situation where oil producers want to continue to produce but also have net zero targets. So
okay, so when it comes to the net zero, as I mentioned, by the definition, it's what you release in terms of the emissions. You need to counterbalance that release of emissions by the removal of those emissions. So different countries can approach the net zero target in different ways. So for Saudi Arabia, where the hydrocarbon sector is the most important sector in the economy, and this is where the idea of the circular carbon economy came. The circular carbon economy imposed that all the carbon that comes from the energy sectors will be dealt with. So it is not about the source of the energy or the fuel, it's about what we do with the carbon. And that's what really matters when it comes to the climate change. We need to reduce or at least avoid releasing greenhouse gas emissions. And as Dr. Youssef mentioned, for Saudi Arabia, the low-hanging or the priority technologies will be the carbon capture and storage. There's also the potential for planting trees, especially with the release of Saudi Green Initiative, Middle Green Initiatives. But what we need to really understand here, we need to understand the scale of those investments and how much investment do we need to put in these areas, so we can make sure that what we release in terms of emissions, we need to counterbalance in terms of also capturing and removing those emissions.
maybe one follow-up question, Aisha. One thing that I, as a person who does not follow the climate negotiations very closely, one thing that I don't really fully understand is how countries and how the climate regime will begin to account for carbon capture, how we'll begin to form global standards on what it means to plant a tree and what the Middle East or the Saudi Green Initiative can mean for carbon capture. Are the climate negotiations discussing these sort of things, accounting standards, to try and understand how we measure these things, how we certify them? Is there movement on the development of this industry?
Okay, so yes, there's something called in the UNFCCC jargon, a term called stock take. So this stock take means there will be an assessment that will be done by the UNFCCC, and as well as some other agencies like the IEA, and these will what they will do. And starting from 2023, they will start to assess the country's achievements of their ambitions that they set in the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. So the system is not clear yet, but the assessments will start to happen starting from 2023. And then at the moment, there are some organizations that do an assessment of how each country is doing its fair share in terms of their contribution or their alignment with the global target of achieving 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius, including the climate action tracker, I believe.
Okay, great. Maybe we'll turn to some questions in the Q&A and also a few kind of mentions of this idea of the circular carbon economy. And in particular, I think a lot of people from outside of Saudi are quite curious and interested as to why Saudi in particular has gravitated towards this language of the circular carbon economy and these 4 Cs. So maybe we can go to you, Paul, and then Youssef. Maybe tell us a little bit about why an oil producer in particular would gravitate towards the circular carbon economy, or what about it and that language, that framing, which was first used, I think, in Saudi's presidency of the G20, has come to the fore in the last year or two.
Well, Saudi Arabia, being a big oil producer, has to give some argument for how they're going to be reducing their carbon emissions. And one way of reducing those emissions is via the 3 R's, the circular carbon economy: reuse, reduce, recycle, and remove. You can reuse it by what Youssef has said and Aisha said about using that CO2 produced to produce hydrogen, to produce ammonia. You can even produce all kinds of other things like the building material from this. There's a lady in Australia that has converted CO2 to building material, and quite strong building material. The CO2 could be removed by putting it underground into caverns that used to be full of oil and natural gas. Well, actually, it can't take all the oil and gas out of a well anyway, so there's going to be some there. But if it's pretty much empty, then you can put the CO2 down there. You can recycle it, again, by producing other things. You can reduce. One thing that Saudi Arabia is looking at, and that it can do, is reduce its use of electricity that comes from mostly gas and oil, now mostly gas, that is used for air conditioning. The pricing structure for electricity could be changed, and I've seen the responses to the pricing structure in Saudi Arabia over recent years. It's been pretty strong. People are responding to a little bit more expensive electricity. But you can push that so far, and it has to be based on the income of the person and the amount of electricity that person or company is using. But Saudi Arabia itself can also use the money from Saudi Aramco. That report from a few years ago certainly pointed out how well off it is, to invest in solar, to invest in hydrogen, to invest in ammonia, which they are doing, to invest in geothermal, which nobody really has mentioned here, but Saudi Arabia has massive resources of geothermal that could reduce the fossil fuels being used for electricity, because a geothermal heat pump reduces the need for any fuel to use for air conditioning or heating whenever is that needed. So there are all sorts of things that the government could do to use the circular carbon economy, to use economic incentives, to use this understanding of its own people, and to move forward with these new technologies at the same time. The big burst in the price of oil, my guess, again, you never know, pie might be in my face right after it happens, that it will be short run. There may be a couple of more boosts in the price of oil. It's hard to tell. It's very difficult to guess this, but I think everyone realizes that oil and gas's time is becoming shortened. But getting the lifting costs in Saudi Arabia are the lowest in the world. I think Iraq might have some lower costs. So if we're talking about the last country standing and the last company standing, they're most likely going to be the national oil companies, like Saudi Aramco, maybe even the Iranian National Oil Company, but their prices for getting oil out of the ground are a bit more expensive. Some of the older fields are cheaper than the newer ones because you have to develop the newer ones. Could be that what's going to happen is less new fields will be developed. And Saudi Arabia will continue to produce oil and gas. I can't see that stopping, but they will also at the same time move toward the alternative future that they can see is coming. There's a reason why NEOM is getting pushed for many reasons. There's a reason why 2030 is still in the books. There's a reason why Saudi Arabia can be an example, a role model for oil producing and oil exporting countries. It's good PR, folks.
Thanks, Paul. Well, we'll go to Dr. Youssef and maybe pose a similar question and ask, if you look 10 years down the line and look at the opportunities for carbon capture, it feels as an observer that carbon capture and a hydrogen strategy are key pillars of this transition, or will be key pillars of this transition, and a way in which Saudi and other oil producers can pivot, use some of their infrastructure, some of their expertise to try and gain a foothold in the supply chain of this energy transition. So where do you see Saudi Arabia making inroads and maybe being a leader in this space in 10 years' time, by 2030, say?
Well, according to what we hear from the Ministry of Energy, the kingdom aims to become an important player, if not the largest player, in the hydrogen markets. So, considering 4 million tons production from blue and green hydrogen by 2030, that's enormous. And here it's not just production, it's also what makes you special in producing hydrogen is the low cost. So, and I would say here, Saudi Arabia, and we saw more recently the Al Jafura gas field, which is one of the world's largest gas fields, and it has an investment exceeding $100 billion by 2030. And much of that gas will be used for blue hydrogen. So I think the opportunities that the kingdom has are enormous. And I believe here we need to have a clear roadmap towards achieving that vision. And I don't think it will be difficult for the kingdom to become a leader in the hydrogen markets, because it exhibits a lot of key features that other countries don't have, and especially in terms of blue hydrogen. Now, when it comes to green hydrogen, which is also important, that what comes from solar energy. We saw the project in Neom between Aqua Power and Air Products, aiming to produce more than 600 tons a year of green hydrogen from solar energy. So just to tell the audience, green hydrogen comes from water and solar energy. Blue hydrogen comes from hydrocarbons with captured carbon. So the amount of or the cost of producing that green hydrogen Neom is one of the world's lowest. And I believe here also Saudi Arabia can play a key role. But I think also we need to look at hydrogen from oil. And that's because we have more oil than what we have gas. And I believe here we need to develop to focus on investment in new technologies that can enable us convert liquid hydrocarbons to hydrogen and not just gas.
Aisha, maybe I'll turn to you to follow up on Youssef's comments. And we know that Oman also has stated aspirations in the hydrogen space. This might be an area of cooperation between the kingdom and Oman, following some high-level visits recently. Maybe tell us a little bit about Oman's hydrogen strategy and how it fits into this mix, and what cooperation we might see between Oman and Saudi.
Sure. So Oman is mainly developing the hydrogen and using the dock on board as a place where it will be exported. And now this high-level relationship between Saudi Arabia and Oman that happened most recently, it aims to create a pipeline that transfer oil from Saudi Arabia to Oman, and that could create an opportunity also for the two countries to cooperate in, the development and also the transport of the hydrogen between the two countries, and using the dock on board as the logistic area for the hydrogen, the Saudi hydrogen, to be also exported to the other countries in the world.
One thing, I think, a question that has come from the Q&A from Muna, but also comes to my mind is, let's say we see these countries in the region adopting this hydrogen strategy and circular carbon economy strategy. How does that look like internally in Saudi Arabia or Oman? How do states in the region incentivize users to turn away from carbon when we still have highly subsidized energy prices? So is it possible that a carbon tax or a carbon pricing system could be internalized in the GCC states? Do you think that's possible? Do you think, or will it have to be all a state-led path where there is carbon trading maybe, but at the level of states and outside of Saudi and the Gulf? What do you think about that, Aisha?
Okay, so let's go back and also acknowledge that the fossil fuel subsidies have been also reduced in the Gulf region most recently. For the Gulf region, actually, it is more to focus on, the removal of the subsidies before we think about putting a tax on the carbon. So that will be the initial stage, and that's already happening, in Oman, in the UAE, and Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia as well. So that would help in terms of reducing the consumption of the energy. And actually, in Saudi Arabia, the reduction in the consumption of the energy has been already happening because of this rise in the fuel prices and the removal of the subsidies, or the reduction of the subsidies. In terms of having a carbon trade market between the GCC, I think this is a more of advanced stage for the GCC countries. So we need to focus at the reduction of the carbon emissions at the national level first. But again, because the hydrocarbon sector and because we have a circular carbon economy approach, the idea is that the hydrocarbon sector is not going to be, phased out overnight. It's going to be there. So what we need to focus on how we can reduce the emissions from this sector, how we can clean up this sector. It is through, as mentioned, through the carbon capture and storage technology. So here is the challenge: is how we can scale up the carbon and capture technologies. At the moment, we do have some projects. One in Abu Dhabi, we have, I think, two in Saudi Arabia, and one in Qatar. But they are more or less in a demonstration stage. So we need to think and we need to advance and scale up the investments in those technologies if we want to continue investing in the hydrocarbon sector. And then in terms of the cooperation, when it comes to the circular carbon economy, perhaps each country, although the GCC countries have common challenges, and they are also similar in too many ways, for example, in their dependence on the hydrocarbon. But the circular carbon economy maybe is more relevant to some countries than the others. For example, for Oman, Oman is not a major emitter for the greenhouse gas emissions. And then also the size of the hydrocarbon sector is not as big as other countries like Saudi Arabia. So also, it might be not economically beneficial for the country to focus on investing on the carbon capture technologies and to focus on cleaning up the hydrocarbon sector, but rather to invest on alternative clean energy technologies like the renewables, the hydrogen, because if they go in the direction where they invest on the carbon capture technologies, then the hydrocarbon resources will, finish in the next 10 to the 15 years. So the economic value of those technologies would not be there in the next decade or so. So this is something also we need to consider when we think about the cooperation around the circular carbon economy.
Great, thank you. I thought what we could do to wrap things up is to go back to each of our panelists and maybe ask them what they think the greatest challenge is, one single challenge that they think could be disruptive to the transition process for Saudi and other Gulf states, and one glaring opportunity. It could be one that we've already mentioned or one that we haven't had a chance to mention. So maybe Paul, we'll start with you. What strikes you as the biggest challenge to Saudi's net zero target and to the transition, and what do you think is the most interesting opportunity?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is how to manage the transition without causing instability in the economy and the society of Saudi Arabia. It has to be constantly looked at. It has to be flexible. It has to be not reactive, but strategic. The biggest opportunity, probably hydrogen and ammonia, and Saudi Aramco has picked up on that. They've done deals with the Japanese and others. There's a huge opportunity. in hydrogen and ammonia. Geothermal is a massive opportunity. I wrote an article about that for SIW. If you look at the Harats near Mecca, Medina in the western part of Saudi Arabia, lots of potential for producing electricity, but also heat pumps can be used any place in Saudi Arabia, any place. In low enthalpy, well, simplify it, low heat geothermal, you can use that for desal using a two-stage geothermal. And what you do is you send up sort of hot water and you vaporize something like methanol or ammonia, which you'll be producing, and that will turn the turbine and that will produce electricity. There are just so many opportunities in the ground in Saudi Arabia that have not been touched. In the sky, the sun, wind in the valleys. Saudi Arabia has a massive set of opportunities that it could use to develop itself and its people for the future. The same holds for the GCC. The biggest risk right now, Iran. Without any doubt, Iran.
All right, Youssef, we'll go to you. What do you think is the most interesting opportunity, maybe one that hasn't been focused on, and what do you think is the biggest challenge to this net zero target and the transition?
Well, as I mentioned in my slides, there are a lot of opportunities, particularly when it comes to the utilization of oil, direct oil into hydrogen. And I believe I haven't really seen a real focus, not just in Saudi, but even globally on that. So I'm a poor person of oil to hydrogen instead of not just focusing on gas. And why is that? Because I believe gas can be directly combusted with carbon capture, while oil, especially heavy oil, and we've got some heavy oil being produced that may not be suitable with more stringent environmental applications, and I believe that presents a huge opportunity to be converted to hydrogen. So I'm a person who believes in science and technology, and I believe there needs to be more investments in R&D and developing technologies that can enable us to directly convert heavy hydrocarbon liquids and directly into hydrogen with carbon capture. So, in particular, I'm interested to see low efficiency and high economic yields. And I believe Saudi Aramco can play a key role in developing these technologies. And the challenge here is actually, I wouldn't say it's not just for Saudi, it's uncertainty. And I believe this is a global challenge. It's we don't know how the pace of energy transition will happen. The world's continue to be addicted to oil, and if the world continues to be addicted to oil, perhaps there will be a little incentives for us in Saudi Arabia to transfer to alternatives or to try and diversify if the world continue to rely mainly on hydrocarbons. So uncertainty here is quite huge, and it's not just us in Saudi Arabia who's going to answer that question. I believe there is global energy transition is a global issue. So uncertainty about the transition, and here comes also the carbon price. What carbon price will be fair for, especially in the kingdom, and how would that affect the private sector? Perhaps we don't have really a big problem in terms of access, but other countries may have concerns about energy access, including India and other countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So I believe these are the challenges that the world can face in Saudi Arabia and other countries.
Thank you, Youssef. Aisha, will you wrap it up for us and tell us what do you think is the biggest challenge and the biggest opportunity facing Saudi and Oman, the Gulf states, to reach these net zero targets?
So I think the biggest challenge, as I mentioned in my presentation or remarks, is to have a strategy to achieve our visions for the climate. And then actually in terms of the opportunities, we are speaking at interesting times for the GCC when it comes to the climate action, because the biggest opportunity that we have nowadays is the political will from almost all the GCC countries to take action on climate. And then I think the other opportunity that we need to focus on is the human resources. and the use of the potential of the youth, who will play a significant role in, enabling the transition to happen. And we know like the youth account for a huge segment of the society. So we need to make sure that we create the right environment for them, especially when it comes to the innovation, technological innovation, and enabling our in the country. And that would also link to raising the awareness of the population, who would be the first people to be impacted by the transition, as well as the people who would play a role in enabling the transition to happen. Because we shouldn't think about the transition from centralized point of view. It's about the people, about individuals who will make it happen.
Okay, on that wonderful egalitarian note, I think we'll draw our panel to a close. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank our panelists, Paul, Youssef, and Aisha. Thank you so much for your remarks and your insight. Also take a minute to thank the people who put this together from the King Faisal Center side, Khulud Al-Umaira, Sara Al-Ataibi, and Ahmed Haroun, who's our interpreter, live interpreter this evening. So with that, thank you all for joining us on YouTube and Twitter and Zoom, and have a good night. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Assalamu.